Hello, welcome. This is Adam Cogan coming from the SSW TV studios live for NDC, and I have the serverless gurus, Adam Stephensen and Duncan Hunter. How are you, boys?
Good, thanks.
Really well, thanks, Adam. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, awesome. How are you enjoying NDC?
Yeah, it's good. Loving it. I just got my hoodie, so I always love my NDC hoodie. So now I'll be living in this for the next year until I get my next one. So
Steve-O, Adam Stephensen, you always enjoyed the crowds and all the questions after and the heavy petting. How are you enjoying that now during coronavirus times?
Look, it's I'm really missing, obviously being at the conference and having the hallway track and catching up with friends from other states and running into, being able to run into those international celebrities and kind of doing a bit of celebrity spotting in the hallways is always, massively exciting. But it's amazing now that we've transitioned into this online world. It is, I'm on the Slack and it's still chatting with everyone and catching up with people, and we're having there's going to be a party tonight, so Dylan's going to play, and we'll all be sitting around in our lounge rooms drinking beers, but still chatting and having the same conversations we always have. So right. It'd be better to be in person, but it's still nice to see everyone.
And Duncan, you guys have spoken a lot together. How is it speaking together when you're not on the same stage?
Yeah, you have to practice hard. It's not as easy, like changing. There's no real tools built for two people like that. So changing presenter and so forth, it's a bit of extra effort, but I think we're all just getting used to it with the modern world, huh?
Yeah.
So it wasn't too bad.
Well, I really enjoyed your session. I'd like to just talk about serverless. Steve, you've been at Microsoft for many years now, and when you first got there, compared with now, are you talking serverless more and more?
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing how, I'm dealing with enterprises, I'm dealing with, banks and governments and organizations you wouldn't necessarily think are early adopters of technology. But I spend most of my time, I'm talking to customers more about serverless technology than non-serverless technology. So the customers that are bringing us in that are doing work in the cloud are really taking a serverless first approach now, which is pretty amazing.
All right, cool. So Duncan, let's talk about what is serverless. To a typical developer that chooses the Microsoft Suite and they're building a web app, they're using .NET Core, they're using app services, they're using a SQL database, that's worked well for them. What does that look like if they're saying, I want to go 100% serverless?
I think it'll probably feel very similar in a sense that you can just turn SQL DB onto a serverless pricing tier, and you can then go write C# in a function. You just won't have a big monolith. It's pretty hard to write a monolith in serverless functions. You'll end up having more kind of microservices. So rather than having one big API, you'll just have lots of different function apps that kind of come together to form your API. But once you get past that and you have your kind of structure set and deciding how you want to lay out your folder system and everything, the tools will feel right at home. It's still SQL and C#. So.
Right. I thought you might be adding logic apps and Cosmos instead of going with SQL
Oh, that's
Server.
a really good question, isn't it? If you're going to go greenfield today, I think I would definitely be having a look in at Cosmos DB, especially if you need to be, across regions and you have to duplicate that data, or you need really fast, or you just want to be a cool kid. But I think Cosmos DB is a pretty big one. But logic apps, I think, is really interesting because, as we mentioned in our talk, the logic apps are in public preview. So we see a lot of customers doing a lot of functions and a lot of our integration customers doing a lot of logic apps. But I think with logic apps now running on the function runtime, it's going to be more like, I'll use a logic app for this and then I'll use a function for that. So we'll see heaps more logic apps, I think, once that kind of gets into GA, which I think is kind of end of year-ish time.
Right. And Duncan, I noticed that you said you can switch SQL Server to serverless, or SQL Server to SQL Server serverless. How much work is it to do that migration?
Oh, that's a good question. Do you know the answer to that? I'm not actually sure if depending on what you're running it on. I think you need to be on our classic PaaS server, SQL to be able to use that consumption tier. But I don't know about downgrading to it. That's a good question.
Yeah, I'm not sure about downgrading, but I think it'll just be another pricing SKU.
Right. In terms of migration,
I haven't actually used it yet.
Okay, so in terms of the migration, as far as I've read the marketing docs, which I haven't done it for real, it is as simple as switching. It's ticking a box, and somehow SQL Server turns into serverless.
Yeah, so that makes sense.
Go for it, Adam.
A lot of the tiers when we're talking about, our PaaS products are really about what is the compute looking like under the covers. So, you might say, I want to go and run SQL Server. And it's about, what size VMs, even though you don't manage them and you don't see them, how big are the VMs and how many of them that are sitting under the covers? When we're talking about these things that are serverless, it's the same with the web application. You can have a web application sitting on, little shared compute or bigger VMs or really big VMs, or you can go and say, actually, I want to use it and I want it, if I'm going to go for a serverless offering, it just means that I'm giving the platform the ability to remove the underlying VMs and leave the storage there. But when I make a request to go, they're actually using that now, so I better provision some compute to power that particular service. So it makes sense that it's just a pricing, a knob that you can turn down to zero.
Yeah, okay. So if you're staying a greenfield application, do you have any, I think you're going to tell me you'd lean towards Cosmos DB over SQL Server serverless. Am I right? And are there any cases that you choose SQL Server serverless?
I'd definitely go SQL Server if I was talking about relational data. I think for me, it makes sense. If you're talking about relational data, then go for, and if you know SQL Server, then go for SQL Server. If you are talking about data there's a lot of use cases where a document database just makes more sense, and in that case, I'd go for Cosmos. The really interesting scenario, though, where we're seeing in cloud scenarios where customers will go Cosmos first, is if you're deploying a web application and you want to stick it in, you've got customers in Australia and the UK and the US. What you want to do is you want to have the compute that's actually powering your web application and the database as close as possible. So with SQL Server, you can put the database in multiple places as read, but you can only have one primary write with SQL Server. So you've got to say all of the writes to the database happen in this particular region. Where we see customers go Cosmos first for web apps is when they say, well, we want to deploy in 3 different countries. We want to have the web apps there. We want to have the databases there. And we want those databases to be written to in those regions. So really multi-region write is the capability of Cosmos that makes it the go-to for really big enterprise scale. If I was just building something that I was just going to deploy in one region and I'm a .NET developer doing MVC today, and I was looking to go serverless, I'd go, I'm just going to write C# and use a function, and I'm going to stick with SQL Server and make the smallest amount of change so I get comfortable with the paradigm, and then I'll pick up some Cosmos as I go along. That's how I'd do it.
And I think, Adam, you made a good point the other day around Cosmos DB and all the different query languages. If someone's comfortable with MongoDB, they can query against Cosmos DB with different query APIs. So you can use Mongo or Cassandra or SQL. So some people starting a project will be more comfortable with things like MongoDB as a query language. So they would probably default to Cosmos for that reason.
All right. So I'd like to step up. The initial conversations with the customer, you're trying to decide, like, they've moved off on-premise. They're happy with the Azure PaaS offerings. You want to have that conversation about, we could go pure serverless. And the question would be, well, what's the pricing difference? I know if I build a .NET core solution, I'm using, app services, I'm using SQL Server. I know my costs. What would it be if I just went pure serverless, Azure Functions, Cosmos DB? And your answer would probably be, Adam? Well, it depends on the workload.
It depends.
And then we can tell.
It's the consultant answer.
Yeah, all right, not very helpful. How
but I think it's also interesting
do I
to think
know
about
my workload? How do I know my workload to give them something a little bit more concrete?
Yeah, you could start making, if you're coming from something greenfield, it's hard to guess how many requests you're going to have and how much data you're actually going to have in storage and so forth. But you could make assumptions and fill that into the pricing calculator and get pretty close to having a guess on that. But what I think it's interesting is the idea of like, how much does it cost just to keep the lights on is an interesting idea versus, yeah.
And so it's not easy, that workload question, is it?
No, it's not. Yeah, to be very accurate, not so easy. To be semi-accurate, not too bad.
And the cheapness that functions come with. You literally get your first 1 million calls a month free. And then beyond that, I'm just going to quickly, if I can pull up the pricing calculator. But when you're talking about a web application making 10 million calls a month, I'm just quickly going to do a quick Azure Functions pricing. When we talk about things like 10 million calls a month being measured in dollars, it's not going to make a massive difference. So with functions, your first 1 million are free, and then after that, it's 27.5 cents for every extra 1 million executions.
Yes, that's
so
hard. Okay.
When we're talking about, if you can talk hundreds of millions of requests in a month and you're still paying dollars, it doesn't really factor that. What we see is that the functions cost doesn't really factor into the price of an enterprise solution.
Right. Okay. So basically, trust me, it will definitely, whatever it is, it should be much less than your traditional. So don't get frightened. I can't tell you exactly, but there will be benefits. So let's talk about the other benefits.
And can I just jump in there though?
Yeah.
Just jumping in there though, if it did get to the point and you wanted to say, I just want to provision this many different app services, you can run functions on an app service. You could say, what I want to pay for is an app service plan with 3 servers of this particular size and these scaling rules, and I actually just want to run my Azure functions on them. And that's just a deployment characteristic where you can say, instead of running on the serverless tier, I want to run them on this app service tier with this particular amount of predictable cost. So, and that's, for me, that's the big thing about functions is it's the productivity of working in an event-driven manner, but it's also the fact that once you write functions and you get your head around writing functions, you can stick them on serverless, you can stick them on your traditional app services, you can run them in Kubernetes, you can run them on your Raspberry Pi, you can run them on a virtual machine, you can run them on-prem. So that's, for me, the benefit of it is functions they're easy to go to Azure, but they actually will run everywhere.
Right. So they should be cheaper, they should be easier to develop, and they're more scalable. Is there any other things to bring up to a client deciding?
They're cool.
Oh, they're cool.
I think they're a little bit more evergreen. If you choose a host your own API, like my experience, I have a project about 2 years old sitting on a serverless compute, and it kind of stays fresh. I rarely do I think about, I just pointed them to a different region the other day, but kind of, I haven't had to go through this and I have to go update, you can update the version of your API, of your functions, but it happens much less often. They're much more evergreen. Right.
So I can tell you that most CEOs I can think of off the top of my head that are 50 plus, the cool factor won't come in, but the fact that the CRUD is more a monolith system, the event-driven development, which is low coupled, you've got .order created, .order shipped, .customer created, that type of system, you think that the developers will find that much more productive?
And massively. The way I look at it is the CEOs don't usually know. It's usually the IT managers and the development managers, and what they care about is security, and that's the first thing out of our customers. They care about security, they care about productivity, and then they care about cost. And we think that they're cheaper to run, but even more than the cheaper to run is it's the cheaper to build and cheaper to operate is kind of the ones that we see. And when we talk about those capabilities and we kind of go, this is what it's going to cost to run, 10,000 concurrent users, or this is a normal, 500 concurrent users on-prem versus on PaaS and on serverless. Serverless just, is really appealing to the business.
Right. Okay. They're great answers. So let's segue onto that security topic. You've got a hardcore security requirement. They take a look at the serverless offerings and they see, all right, these Azure functions and these logic apps and flows and Power Automates, these have got publicly addressable endpoints here. This is, I don't like the sound of this at all. What is the story to isolate this so that isn't there? And is it hard? Is it expensive, etc.?
Go for it, Adam.
So we have this conversation all the time. We often get brought in by developers want to go for the serverless route. The customers we deal with, the governments and banks and your big retailers and the companies that have a real security posture. And that's usually the big blocker with us is, let's talk security. The nice thing about it is that, so I've kind of learnt these days is that whenever I look at a solution, I always bring security and the IT pro team in as early as I can and go, let's talk about what we can do and keep management in the conversation, because for me, it's really a spectrum, and we can go for serverless on one end, which is massively scalable, going to be really cheap, is going to be massively productive. But we have, ASIO and the Department of Defense and all of the banks, they're running all of their platforms in the cloud these days as well. So we can absolutely do secure, and without getting into the whys of it too much. But if in serverless, you're sharing infrastructure and you're sharing compute, and that's why it's cheap. We can take your Azure functions or your web applications, and we can deploy them onto VMs and infrastructure that's just dedicated to you, that's completely locked down, that you can go and wrap your old school firewalls around and put it on a private IP address space, but it's going to cost you a lot more money. So we can do that. We can do the serverless one, or we can do this option there's a few options in the middle that we can leverage. And so we're trying to get the decision makers and the security team in and go, let's have a realistic look of what this application is, and do you want to pay the money for the ultimate security? Is it low risk and we can use ultimate flexibility, or which end of the spectrum are you falling on? And then we give them some prices, and then they kind of tell us. They look at the prices and they go, oh, we don't want that one. We definitely don't want that one. It's probably where this application belongs.
So, Steve-O, assume that I'm stuck on this public URLs. I'm very security conscious. I want to isolate it. I want a VNet solution. What is the Azure story for that?
So you should definitely go and watch our talk, because there's a deep breakdown of exactly the architecture that we would kind of talk to you about. But when you go for the super secure solution, we're saying take your application and deploy it in a private address space where, when we deploy a web app in the cloud, you don't just get the VM for the web app. There's also like a scale controller that manages scale, and there's the infrastructure that we use to manage that virtual machine. In the ultimate secure architecture, you get one of those all to yourself that you don't have to share with anyone. All of that shared stuff, you get a reserved copy, which is expensive. If you're happy to say, well, we want to use a PaaS web application, and we want to use a PaaS SQL server, we have two features that I think all developers in the cloud or in Azure should be across, and that's the private link and VNet integration. And basically, private link says, take my web app, my Azure web app or my Azure function, and I can actually lock it off so there's no private IP address, there's no public IP address or website. And the only way to get to that function or web app is via this private IP address that's internal to my network. And that the security teams see that and often go, oh, well, that solves our problem, and I don't have the cost associated with isolated compute. So let's go with that option. And then VNet integration is the other feature to get your head around. And basically, VNet integration says, I'm going to let that web application that's sitting out, or any other web application that's sitting out in the public address space, talk to stuff that's in the private address space. So the way I would kind of go is I've got a web app, I'm going to lock it down with the private IP address, and then I'm going to so the only way to get to the web app is via that private IP address. Now my web app is going to talk to a SQL server that only has a private IP address. So I'll use VNet integration for my web app to talk to the SQL server's private IP address. And now everything's locked down.
And is the key to this the Azure Application Gateway?
Azure App Gateway is a great, it's not, I wouldn't say it's the key to it. It's a key to it if you want that really super isolated.
Yes.
If you want a really isolated network, if you're the hardcore guy.
We see it a lot. People who anyone who wants to use API management normally have an internal API, and they use that App Gateway as their switch to say, I'll come in from the public internet and I'll switch. You use that in front of your internal API. So you have to make it through that App Gateway and that firewall to switch to your internal API that isn't facing to the rest of the world. That's definitely one of the common things we see people use it for, but that kind of entry point into your whole system.
The thing I want to jump up and down a bit on, though, is Duncan and I mostly are dealing with government, financial institutions, massive commercials.
Yes.
If you're not one of those, I think an app gateway is probably massive overkill.
Yes,
so
I understand. I just wanted to go to the hardcore guy first.
That's dealing with IT teams that want to do network isolation. The cloud, I've spent so many conversations with customers explaining that that's not necessarily required. What I would do, and this is where probably the pivot is to what Duncan and I are advocating, and we're talking about to lots of customers around, is what we would rather you do is do a cheaper, easier solution that is still secure, but it's secured using authorization and identification and modern security best practices. So what we do instead there, leave the URL on your web application. You might want to use private link for your databases, but use something like Azure Front Door and have a WAF in Azure Front Door, which is easier and cheaper to deploy than an app gateway, which has to go into a private address space. Whack Front Door out the front, use Active Directory authentication, have it talking to a web app or a function that's in the public address space, but actually have it secured using authentication and authorization. And then if you want to use private link for your SQL server and your database, then that's great. But I think an app gateway for most people who are out there building web apps is probably overkill.
Okay. So, all right, Front Door, we're talking just some hundreds of dollars or some thousands of dollars per month?
Hundreds.
Beautiful. All right, and that also does the other functionality such as Cloudflare and your CDN work as well. It does other things as well. Right.
Yeah.
So let's go to the other end. I'm more of a relaxed guy. I don't mind the public URLs. I do care about security. Is there any easy things I can do to make my Azure functions a little more secure than out of the box?
Azure Functions, there are lots and lots of different security features out of the box. And the question is which security features? You can use IP address restrictions. There's a number of, and it all depends on what you're trying to do. I would be looking at using Azure Front Door and Active Directory to use it for authentication. And I think for a lot of the use cases that if you're building a small enterprise solution, I think that's probably where, I think that's, I'm hesitant to say, I think that's probably enough when it comes to a security conversation. But I think, when you're evaluating things, I don't think you need to go overkill. I think you need to look at what the features that are there and what the risk of your actual application is.
Is there a way of binding your Azure functions to just approved callers using that IP technique you just mentioned?
Well, it's actually, so a really interesting piece, and so Duncan called out API management earlier, and there's a product that we have in Azure called API management, and it essentially, it's one of my favorite pieces of Azure. And the idea is you have Azure Front Door out the front, which gives you your web application firewall and application acceleration, and it has the CDN capabilities. Then you've got your APIs in the back end, and they might be in Kubernetes or functions or web apps. They could be old SOAP services. And then you have API management in the middle that essentially is the management layer for all of your APIs. And then it can be the layer that does all of the authentication of you. It's a single pane of glass. It doesn't have any of the compute, but it's what it handles all of your incoming requests, handles the authorization. It can do things like retry policies and caching. And then it can then connect to APIs that have external addresses as well as internal addresses. So it can even reach back, if you've got the premium version, all the way to on-prem APIs and surface them publicly. It also has a developer portal for developers so they can go in and copy-paste code when they want to use code for a particular API. But back to your question about security, that can often be the single pane of glass that you use for security, and it provides that security layer in front of all of your APIs. So I think, often that's a really good place to start look at managing and securing your APIs.
Okay. And if I take your advice and add API management, are we adding hundreds a month or thousands a month?
Well, depending where you run it in terms of network isolation, you can choose the consumption plan. So you just pay for what you use. So you'll probably be and again, it depends on how much workload you're running. So I guess, Adam, it comes back to your tricky point of how do you price up something serverless? So yeah, but for what's a normal workload? How many requests are you processing?
I think you're showing it's a hard one, and it's one that we've got to make easier over time.
Yeah, if you're talking about a dev environment and a hello world sort of setup where you're not doing a million requests, you're going to be under $100 to be running that in a consumption-based way for sure. But then you can scale up to a lot more, of course, because if you have a really huge API surface with 10 or 20 or 100 APIs for a big government org, and you're getting all of them are getting smashed with 100,000 requests a day each, then yeah, you can start spending more.
Right.
And that's probably a good place to plug our. So Duncan and I are actually working on an open source project, and if you go to, I'm going to get the URL wrong.
I put it in the chat already.
So if you go to GitHub and look at Azure Modern Apps, and then the Azure Modern Web project, we're working with some friends and partners on an open source project that literally says, if we were building a modern web application today, we would go and we would use some JavaScript framework, and we would go and stick it behind Azure Front Door that then went and talked to a serverless API management layer that then went and talked to Azure Functions that then talked to, and the demo we're using is using Cosmos and storage. And it also shows how easy it is then to geo-replicate that whole solution into another region. So if you're interested in checking that out, then come and please get involved.
Wow, that sounds like the answers to almost everything. Tell me, does this conversation about serverless include Docker? And we talk a lot about containers and deploying to containers so we can easily add VMs and nodes, and scaling up we can control. But is that out of the conversation when we're talking serverless?
No, I think we're seeing a lot of people, and Adam talks about this a little bit in our talk that we gave, that a bunch of customers you can run functions everywhere. So if you want to run your functions in Kubernetes, you can do that and get that same sort of paradigm, event-driven programming paradigm out of your developers. Might not be managing the platform that is Kubernetes, but the way they program to build their APIs or manage their other kind of workloads would be just to write functions, and they're kind of using it as if they were working in the cloud with a function, but they're actually underlying it's deployed to the Kubernetes.
But once you've got Kubernetes, AKS Kubernetes in the picture, and you now have this kind of fixed cost that isn't based on utilization. Is that right?
Oh, it's a good question. Adam, do you want to talk about Cater?
Not really. Look, I think this
I
is
can give a rough summary if we want.
Yeah, look, I'd love to have a whole nother conversation, Adam, around Kubernetes, containers, serverless, where we can stick it. The short version of it is you can take a container. Azure has the way to take any one container and execute it serverlessly. Execute it, dispose of it, charge you for the seconds it runs. We can also then take a Kubernetes cluster, which usually has nodes which are underlying virtual machines. And imagine taking those underlying virtual machines instead of using one of those nodes as a virtual machine, I'm going to use this serverless Kubernetes container offering that's going to look to Kubernetes like a node, but really it's a whole lot of serverless compute that lets us scale infinitely. I'd love to come back and do a whole containers and where are they going and what are the challenges on conversation, because it's an awesome conversation, but it's one we could easily spend another half an hour on.
All right, so don't worry about that. You actually answered my question, because I thought when you were talking serverless, you don't include, Docker, AKS, that container story is outside, but you kind of said that's within the frame of what we're talking about. That's all serverless too.
Absolutely.
So
you can take a container and run a container in a function that's running serverlessly.
Yeah. Is this Inception or something?
And you can also then take a Kubernetes cluster that's not serverless, that's running on-prem on your virtual machines, and run functions inside that Kubernetes cluster.
All right, thank you. I have a headache, so we have to wrap this up. But you know what we need from Microsoft is we need a beautiful infographic that I can put on the inside of the toilet and look at all these terms and just learn over time what this all is. Because there's just a lot of stuff that you just have to get, in your head. And we need a nice map to navigate this.
Yeah. Adam, if you promise to stick one up in every bathroom in SSW, I'll make sure we get it made.
We have in our toilets we have the 10 things that make your website stink. So it's appropriate.
Really?
Anyway, all right. Anyway, no more talk about Azure Front Door or the associated technologies. That was fantastic. I think we have lots of cool stuff to learn, and I am looking forward to re-watching your presentation, because it was a fantastic talk, boys. So thank you so much for your time, and with that, this is Adam Cogan signing off for SSW TV.